in the frozen, pre-dawn silence of a Belgian forest. The most fearsome weapon of the Nazi war machine sat inert, a sleeping metal giant. Its fate was not to be decided by a heroic charge or a cunning ambush, but by the absence of a single, mundane liquid. This is the story of how the greatest armored spearhead of the Battle of the Bulge was not shattered by steel, but strangled by emptiness. On the morning of December 17, 1944, a deep cold held the Ardennes in its grip. Within this ancient woodland, a creeping paralysis was taking hold. At the head of a column stretching back for miles into the mist, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, a man forged in the brutal fires of the Eastern Front, stood atop the hull of his command vehicle Knigstiger, or King Tiger tank. This was a 70-ton behemoth, with armor that could shrug off most Allied guns and a cannon that could kill at staggering range. Yet now, it was nothing more than a very expensive, very cold piece of immobile scrap. Peiper slammed a gloved hand against the frozen turret in frustration. All around him, the story was the same. The low grumble of diesel engines had been replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the wind and the muttered curses of his elite soldiers. Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group of nearly 5,000 of Germany's finest Waffen-SS troops, 67 tanks, and hundreds of armored vehicles, was dead in the water. They were the designated spearhead for Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's audacious, desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. Their orders were to move with lightning speed, bypass resistance, and cross the Meuse River within 48 hours. But just one day into the offensive, they had achieved a state of perfect stagnation. They were not an armored fist, but a traffic jam. The culprit was absurdly simple, yet utterly insurmountable. The fuel gauges, every single one of them, read empty. This was not a minor logistical hiccup. It was the manifestation of a terminal disease that had been consuming the German war effort. For over a year, Peiper, a skilled and ruthless commander, had known the risks. The offensive plan itself was a confession of weakness. His written orders contained a critical, almost pathetic clause. They were to prioritize the capture of Allied fuel depots. The Blitzkrieg, the very doctrine of lightning war perfected by Germany, now relied on stealing gasoline from the enemy to function. The nation that had once raced across Europe in a blur of coordinated armor and aircraft could no longer produce enough fuel to power its own instruments of conquest. The plan was to literally run on the enemy's blood, and now, just miles into their sprint, their hearts were seizing up as his men shivered in their steel coffins. A scout returned with a report that sent a jolt through the stalled column. The small village of Honsfeld, just ahead, had been an American supply depot. The G's had apparently abandoned it in great haste. Here, perhaps, was salvation. Peiper ordered a detachment forward. What they found was surreal. In the village, evidence of a recent and rapid departure was everywhere. Mugs of coffee, still faintly warm, sat on tables. Cigarettes smoldered in ashtrays. It was as if the Americans had simply vanished into the thin winter air. And then, in a field on the village outskirts, they saw it. A stockpile that made their hearts leap. Row upon row, stack upon stack of pristine American jerry cans, glinting dully in the weak light. Thousands of them. A junior officer, hands trembling slightly from cold and anticipation, pried open a can. The potent, volatile smell of high-octane gasoline wafted out. It was the sweetest scent in the world. The news raced back to the column. Within minutes, a wave of frantic activity replaced the grim stillness. Men spilled from their vehicles, grabbing cans, unscrewing fuel caps, pouring the precious liquid with a desperate haste. The clanging of metal and the shouts of soldiers shattered the forest silence. Peiper walked slowly through this incredible bounty, a modern-day Midas surrounded not by gold, but by a more practical treasure. He did the math. Roughly 50,000 gallons. It was a staggering amount, enough to fill the tanks of every King Tiger, every Panther, every half-track and truck in his entire battle group. Enough fuel to get them roaring, back to life, to smash through to the Meuse and perhaps even beyond. In that moment, standing amidst the whirlwind of refueling, it felt like a miracle, a divine gift. The offensive, teetering on the brink of immediate failure, was back on. The war, against all odds, suddenly felt winnable again. But as Peiper watched his elite SS troops, the pinnacle of Nazi ideology and military prowess, hunched over their vehicles, pouring American fuel into the engines of German Panzers, a cold, dissonant thought began to worm its way through his relief. It was a question so fundamental, so terrifying in its implications, that he almost tried to dismiss it. Why? Why would the enemy leave this here? This was not a small cache. This was a king's ransom in fuel, the very lifeblood of mobile warfare. If the Americans could afford to abandon what to Germany represented a war-winning treasure, what did that say about the enemy they were facing? Was this a miracle, or was it, in fact, a kind of trap? A demonstration of such overwhelming abundance that it rendered German courage and skill irrelevant? The hook was set. The first chilling inkling of a truth far larger than any battlefield began to take hold. To understand the profound shock lurking beneath Peiper's momentary joy, you must first grasp the desperate state of the Third Reich in the winter of 1944. Germany was not just low on fuel. It was running on fumes, both literally and metaphorically. For over a year, the Allied strategic bombing campaign, particularly the relentless focus of the US 8th Air Force and Britain's RAF Bomber Command, had set its sights on a critical target: Germany's synthetic fuel industry. The results were catastrophic for the Nazi war machine. Vast synthetic oil plants, like the Lunar Works, which Hitler had called the cornerstone of our war economy, saw their output slashed by over 95%. The once booming refineries at Politz, Bleckhammer and Brucks were reduced to skeletal, smoking ruins operating at less than 10% of their capacity. The effects rippled through every branch of the German armed forces. The mighty Luftwaffe, which had once darkened the skies of Europe, was now largely grounded. It wasn't for lack of advanced aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me 160 jet fighter. It was for lack of the specialized aviation fuel to fly them. Pilot training became a cruel joke, where a new Luftwaffe pilot might have received hundreds of flight hours in 1940. By late 1944, he was lucky to get 60 before being thrown into combat. A half-trained lamb to the slaughter. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, became a fleet in being, a ghost armada of battleships like the Tirpitz and heavy cruisers that rusted at their moorings, unable to sortie for lack of marine diesel. Their power was theoretical, neutered by logistics. On the home front, the situation was equally dire. Civilian gasoline had been banned for years. The black market for a single liter of fuel was thriving and brutally punished by the Gestapo. The German economy, in a grotesque reversal of modernity, was regressing. Trucks were replaced by horse-drawn carts, tractors sat idle in fields. The nation that had launched the world's first blitzkrieg was being forced back into a pre-industrial age by a ruthless arithmetic of scarcity. This was the brittle reality upon which Hitler had gambled. Everything in the Ardennes. The offensive wasn't just a military attack, it was a Hail Mary pass born of logistical desperation. Now, shift your gaze across the Atlantic. Contrast Germany's agonizing thirst with the situation in the United States. America in 1940 didn't just have an oil industry, it was the oil industry. It produced a mind-boggling 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil that year. To put that in a perspective that would have broken the spirit of a German logistician, the United States was producing more oil every single day than Germany would manage in an entire month. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of Axis-occupied Europe combined. This wasn't a gap. It wasn't even a chasm. It was the difference between a dripping faucet and Niagara Falls. While German quartermasters were using eyedroppers to ration fuel, American engineers were dealing with problems of such monumental scale and abundance that they had to invent entirely new systems of distribution. The first solution to the Allied fuel crisis after the breakout from Normandy was the famed Red Ball Express, a logistical feat born of sheer necessity. It was a dedicated, non-stop trucking route closed to all other traffic and operated round the clock, manned largely by African-American trucking companies. At its height, nearly 6,000 trucks hauled more than 12,500 tons of supplies a day. Much of it fuel. The gasoline burned just to keep those trucks moving exceeded the entire fuel. allocation of a German army group. And yet, even this monumental effort could not fully satisfy the appetite of Patton's tanks or Eisenhower's expanding front. So the Allies attempted something unprecedented: Operation PLUTO pipeline under the ocean. Engineers laid flexible, armored pipelines across the English Channel from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, creating a continuous circulatory system of fuel. By December 1944, PLUTO was pumping more than 1 million gallons of gasoline per day directly into France. From the Normandy coast, pipelines snaked inland behind advancing armies like metallic veins. The scale was staggering. The U.S. First Army alone consumed 1.2 million gallons daily, while its logistics system delivered 1.4 million, enough to fight one of the largest battles of the Western Front and still add to reserves each night. This was the vast industrial reality Joachim Peiper only dimly sensed as his men celebrated their astonishing stroke of luck in Honsfeld. The 50,000 gallons of fuel they had captured felt miraculous, the salvation of Kampfgruppe Peiper. In truth, it represented less than 5% of what the Allies pumped across the Channel every single day. It was a rounding error. As his troops worked, evidence of this imbalance emerged in ways that felt cruelly personal. A sergeant who spoke English brought Peiper abandoned shipping manifests. The flimsy papers traced the gasoline's journey, refined in Port Arthur, Texas, shipped to New York, carried across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to Liverpool, transported across Britain, pumped through PLUTO to Normandy, and finally trucked for 100 miles to this obscure Belgian village. Over 6,000 miles in under 6 weeks. Peiper read the documents and went pale. The enemy's supply line was not fragile, it was a transatlantic superhighway. Then another blow landed. A soldier found copies of Stars and Stripes, dated just 2 days earlier. One headline announced a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun with a capacity of 300,000 gallons per day. A single secondary pipeline, untouchable and unseen, was delivering 6 times. Peiper's war-saving haul every day. Triumph curdled into dread. They were not fighting soldiers alone, but an industrial civilization whose excess dwarfed Germany's total capacity. Still, refueled with American gasoline and grim resolve, Kampfgruppe Peiper surged forward again. They smashed through Bullingen, capturing ammunition, supplies, and, crucially, American operational maps. But the maps only deepened the horror. They marked Allied fuel depots everywhere. 50,000 gallons here, 100,000 there. At nearly every road junction and village. The US First Army alone had more than 3.5 million gallons, sitting in reserve dumps just behind the lines. Peiper's desperate offensive was crawling through a landscape littered with more fuel than German planners had dared imagine. This imbalance began to warp the campaign's morality. Racing against time and constantly fearing empty tanks, Peiper's units committed the infamous atrocity at the Bornes crossroads near Malmedy, where surrendered American artillerymen were machine-gunned in a field. Later justifications varied, but one explanation from subordinates was chillingly logistical. They lacked the fuel and manpower to guard and transport prisoners. Scarcity translated into brutality. The pressure of the fuel gauge became lethal. By the evening of December 17th, Peiper's advance guard reached Stavelitan. There, just outside town, they saw what appeared to be the culmination of their gamble. It was the largest American fuel depot in the sector, a 15-acre complex holding more than 2 million gallons of gasoline. This was not a cache, it was an ocean. Enough fuel to reach the Meuse or even Antwerp. Enough, in theory, to win the Battle of the Bulge. As German tanks rumbled toward the perimeter, they saw Americans moving among towering stacks of jerry cans. These men were not forming defenses or loading trucks. They were engineers executing denial orders. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had prepared carefully, laying trails of fuel and positioning white phosphorus grenades. As the first Panzers crested the hill at dusk, Brewster gave the signal. What followed was not merely an explosion, but an apocalypse. A roaring wall of flame erupted hundreds of feet into the air, instantly engulfing the depot. The sky turned orange, a pillar of black smoke rose for miles, visible across the Ardennes. The heat scorched paint from German tanks and forced them back. The inferno burned for 3 days, consuming fuel that could have powered both German panzer armies to Antwerp and back. Peiper stood on his command tank, face lit by the firestorm, watching his last real chance vanish. An officer later recalled Peiper turning away and saying, "Holly, they can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to keep it from us. What are we truly doing here?" This was the second and final revelation. American waste exceeded German necessity. The scene repeated itself across the Ardennes. At Spa, engineers destroyed 2.5 million gallons. At Francorchamps, another million. In the first week of the battle, Americans deliberately burned more than 8 million gallons of their own fuel. To German commanders like Hasse von Manteuffel, this seemed insane, more fuel than the Wehrmacht had allocated for the entire offensive, treated as disposable. For the US command, it was simple arithmetic: fuel was replaceable. Losing the war was not. The disparity became almost surreal. While Peiper's men siphoned the last drops from wrecked vehicles, the US Army Air Forces mounted a massive aerial resupply to the encircled 101st Airborne at Bastogne. C-47 transports dropped over 160,000 gallons of gasoline in a single day. The Americans were airlifting more fuel to one surrounded division than Peiper possessed for his entire thrust. German logistics were linear and desperate. American logistics were three-dimensional and limitless. By December 20th, the end arrived via radio. Peiper's fuel convoy, inching along muddy roads, had been spotted and annihilated by Allied fighter bombers. No resupply was coming. In a Belgian farmhouse, Peiper gathered his officers. A lieutenant delivered the final numbers, fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse bridges were 30 kilometers away. They were close yet impossibly far. Peiper spoke the truth they all now understood. They were fighting an enemy who burned more fuel denying it than Germany had issued for the operation itself. The miracle at Honsfeld had been pocket change. A war against such an economy could not be won. 3 days later, on December 23rd, the weather cleared. The cloud cover that had shielded the Germans vanished, and Allied air power returned in overwhelming force. Over 2,000 fighter bomber sorties struck that day alone. A single P-47 burned 300 gallons per hour. The fuel consumed by Allied aircraft that day exceeded the Luftwaffe's entire monthly allocation on the Western Front. Under this aerial hammer, Peiper's position around La Gleize collapsed. On Christmas Eve, he gave the final order. Everything would be abandoned. His elite SS troops became demolition teams, placing charges in the engines and turrets of their remaining 39 Tigers and Panthers. They destroyed half-tracks and support vehicles, draining the last fuel not to escape, but to ensure the wrecks burned completely. Then, under falling snow and darkness, Peiper and roughly 770 survivors slipped away on foot, leaving behind a graveyard of armor steel monuments to a war lost far from the battlefield. The story of the 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld is more than a dramatic anecdote. It is a parable of industrial war, the moment romantic notions of heroism finally died. Tactical skill, experience, even technological superiority mattered less than production and logistics. The war was decided not in forests or towns, but in steel mills, shipyards, and oil fields. In 1944, the Allies held a 5-1 advantage in tanks and aircraft, but in petroleum, the advantage was closer to 50-1. When American salvage teams later inspected Peiper's abandoned vehicles at La Gleize, their report was devastating in its simplicity. To recover all 39 tanks required 8,000 gallons of fuel. The source was listed as local reserves, time required for hours. What had seemed a miracle to Peiper was, for the US Army, a minor task to be completed after lunch. That was the ultimate lesson of the Ardennes. Courage and genius were variables, but logistics ruled the equation. The empty fuel gauge in Peiper's Tiger was not mechanical failure, it was the signature of a defeated nation. Today, one of those abandoned King Tigers still sits in La Gleize, not as a symbol of glory, but as a silent question mark, a monument to the moment an army learned that no amount of will can overcome the absence of means.